In Washington, D.C., we welcome Ivan Semeniuk, science journalist and a news editor for the journal Nature. Ivan will be our guide this week as we explore the frontiers of science. Tonight, in the first part of our conversation, we look at the future direction of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Hi, Ivan. Good of you to be on the program.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, I want to begin with, since the early 80s, NASA has been synonymous with the shuttle program. Why is the shuttle, remind us, why is it being wound down now, the shuttle program?
Right, so this is really the end of an era now with the final shuttle flight behind us. I think it's probably useful to go back to the 80s, to that period, in fact, even a little bit earlier, to the 70s, and revisit what that program was meant to be and sort of what it turned into. The metaphor, I think, for space exploration is sort of the Wild West. There was a period of time where it was a new territory being opened up shortly after the first orbital flights. There was a sense that humans could be sent into space and that this was a new territory to be explored for strategic reasons. It was the Cold War, and there was also a sense of excitement of what might be discovered by opening up this new frontier. And very much like the opening up of the West, at least in a sort of American metaphor, you had the cowboys, you had the first explorers that were out there in the Wild West, and you could say that was the Apollo program. You had those early space flights, and then those first incredible journeys to the moon landings. The Apollo astronauts were sort of the cowboys of that time. And of course, in the Western metaphor, what followed the cowboys was the railway, the coming of the railroad, which then opened up the West to anyone who wanted to go. So rather than taking weeks and weeks to get out into the Western frontier, you could have someone out there in a matter of days. So the space shuttle, I think, is best seen as something that was supposed to be that railway to space, something that would not just be taking the test pilots or the cowboys, but in fact taking everybody, scientists, teachers, journalists, tourists, anyone who wanted to see space, and that it was going to be very cheap and really it was kind of going to make space commonplace. That was the idea. And when the space shuttle rolled out, it was rolled out in a sense that there was going to be commercial possibility and a lot more space travel in the future. So the program got off the ground, and of course there have been many flights, well over 100 flights, but it never really materialized into this sense that space is commonplace and people are going every month or every week. Of course, we had two terrible catastrophes. Two of the shuttles were lost, both Challenger and Columbia, so 14 lives were lost in those two missions. And I think that really underscored the sense that space is never going to be easy. It's never going to be entirely safe. So it's a fascinating frontier, but in a sense a kind of limited frontier that we need to think about why we're sending people. I think that's where we're at now.
So that's how we got to today. Shuttle is over. What's next? What's NASA have planned for its future?
Well, the thing that is at the top of the list is the International Space Station, which was a large part of the shuttle program. The latter half of the shuttle program was very much invested in building up the International Space Station, which has the U.S. as sort of the central player, but there are many international partners: Europe, Russia, Canada, of course, and Japan. So there are a lot of investments in this International Space Station. You could say it's the most expensive laboratory ever built. And finally, now that it's up and running and it has a capacity for 6 crew members, there's a sense that somehow this thing needs to deliver and be a platform for certain kinds of experiments. So the question is, with the shuttle no longer online, how do we get people to the space station? How do we get supplies to the station? How do we get science apparatus up and down? So at the moment, really the only way to get there, with humans at least, is with a Soyuz capsule, with a Russian Soyuz rocket. And there are several flights now planned to change over the space station crews. But of course, that leaves, at the moment, the U.S. without any capability of flying astronauts on its own. It's a fairly uncomfortable position for the U.S. to be in. not unlike the period of time between the winding down of Apollo and the beginning of the space shuttle. And there's a sense that the next generation of human space flight has to get rolling in the U.S. So there are a couple of things at work. NASA is developing its own vehicles and its own rocket capability for for this new chapter beyond the shuttle. But there's going to be a gap. It'll be at least 2016 before we start to see those launches. So in the meantime, the commercial space flight industry, this kind of nascent commercial industry, is stepping in. One of the leaders is SpaceX, which is Elon Musk's company. There's a Falcon rocket, which is able to carry up this capsule called the Dragon capsule, and already they're testing this as a way of getting supplies to the station and potentially humans as well. So I think we're going to see a lot more about this in the next 2 years.
You mentioned the Dragon. I actually am going to ask to bring up a picture of the Dragon. This is that commercial space craft that is being privately built by an American company. Now, it says that its aim is to develop sort of a family of launch vehicles and ultimately reduce the cost and increase the reliability of space access. But Ivan, it doesn't look exactly like it, but it does sort of remind me of, George Jetson's Aero car. We're all sort of buzzing around with great ease. And I'm wondering, is that the case with the Dragon? How easy is it for us to be able to get around? Is this a realistic thing that we're looking at?
Well, I mean, it is realistic. It's already had one successful orbit, and it's already had one successful launch and return, and there's going to be a docking with the space station in the future. I'm sure in the next year we're going to see that. So it's very much a reality now. It's funny, though, when you mention the George Jetson thing, because I think with all of these things we're seeing the future, but also kind of retro at the same time. In a way, commercial space flight is I think, going back to the tried and true, looking like some of the original capsules that went up in the 70s and earlier, and, kind of no nonsense, get the job done, get people where they need to be, get supplies where they need to be, and not quite the elaborate flight system that we had with the shuttle. I guess the real innovation here is, NASA has always contracted out the building of rockets and spacecraft. That's going right back to the beginning. Even the moon lander, the lunar module, was built by Northrop Grumman, for example. And there are lots of contractors that have a long history with NASA. The difference is here that NASA is now, or that the U.S. government is, contracting out or looking to contract out the entire transportation system. That SpaceX, say with the Dragon capsule, or or other companies could come online and basically, we'll look after getting you there, for a certain cost, and we'll keep to that cost. So it's the privatization of going to low Earth orbit, and the theory then is that would allow NASA some flexibility and freedom to concentrate on the real frontier, which is beyond low Earth orbit. Because the space shuttle and the space station are really not that far away. They're just a few hundred kilometers above the ground. If you think about the distance between Toronto and Montreal, that's basically how far up the space station is, roughly speaking. So it's not that far. Space is not far away. But once we start looking about, at the moon, asteroids, Mars, and so on, that's the real frontier. And the thinking now in this current administration is that's where NASA needs to focus.
You mentioned that NASA is concentrating its efforts and letting private companies do other things. So tell me, what else beyond the things that we think that NASA does, which is put people in space, work on the shuttle and things, what else does NASA do?
Well, NASA has quite a few functions. I mean, it's also doing Earth observing. So there are a number of satellites which are trained on the Earth as opposed to out into space. In terms of the science, we have the exploration of the planets with robotic probes that have now gone to every planet in our solar system. I used to say every planet except Pluto, but since Pluto's no longer a planet officially, we could say now that we've had a spacecraft go to every planet. And also astronomy, the Hubble Space Telescope, other telescopes that look deep beyond our solar system out into the galaxy, out to the edges of the universe. These are all things that NASA does, and I think these are things that are seen to be quite valuable. They have a lot of traction with the public. Everyone loves those fabulous Hubble Space Telescope pictures, for example. And so that's an important part of what NASA does, although in terms of the budget, that's actually a small part of, relatively small part of its overall budget, which is about $20 billion, just a little bit less. A lot of it is, this very large human spaceflight program, because sending people is always going to be the most important, or it's always going to be the most expensive thing to do.
Well, let me ask you about that, because last year President Obama put to Congress, let's scrap the Constellation program, which was supposed to be the next thing, and said, let's concentrate NASA more on research and development. Do you think that was the right move? I mean, aside from the cost perspective.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I'm approaching this not as an advocate for space, but as a journalist. So from my perspective, it's a wise move. I mean, this was based on the Augustine report. There was a commission that was struck and a report that was created that basically said that the Constellation program is too expensive. It can't be supported. It can't deliver on the goals it was supposed to for the money that's available. And just to bring all of our viewers in, the Constellation program is what was established during the George Bush administration, right after about a year after the Columbia disaster. So once the Columbia, the second space shuttle, was lost, there was a sense that the shuttle program was not enough, and that there needed to be a new vision for the future direction of human spaceflight. So out came the Constellation program, which was meant to create kind of a new suite of launch vehicles, a crew capsule, and it would replace the shuttles, which of course the fleet was aging and in need of replacement. So there's a new transportation system needed, and it was meant to take that place, but then also to go beyond simply going to the station, but to perhaps be more inspirational, return to the moon, and pave the way for beyond. So that was all fine, but the budget was never really there to support Constellation, and I think what the current administration did was actually follow the recommendations of that commission and say, we don't have the money, but there are things that need to be researched, tested, developed in order to take the next step, and that was the idea. Meanwhile, bringing in private space flight to take on the sort of routine, it's never routine, but the routine task of getting people up to the space station, for example, and fostering that at the same time. So that's the idea. But there are a lot of politics here. NASA has been deeply woven into the political culture in the U.S. for many years. NASA centers are distributed all around the U.S. That's a lot of jobs. For the contractors that work with NASA, it's even a larger part of local economies. So there is resistance to scaling back in whatever NASA is doing. Congressmen who have NASA centers in their districts, for example, are always leaping to defend and to prevent changes. But I think there's a recognition that there needs to be a more sensible approach to space that somehow is affordable, in keeping with fiscal realities, but still inspirational and still keeping the U.S. I mean, again, this is just from the U.S. perspective, but keeping the U.S. kind of as a leader, as a world leader in this exploration.
You say the word sensible and then inspirational, and I'm thinking that when most people think of NASA,
it's a contradiction.
They have this very romantic view of NASA, and is NASA still a dream incubator for the U.S.?
That's a wonderful way of putting it, and I think people do have to realize that, and it's been said before, that NASA is really in the inspiration business. That it's an elevating sense. There's no doubt about it. I mean, the opening up of space in the 1960s was a strategic thing. I mean, when Sputnik flew over in 1957, it was a game changer. Just imagine, everyone knew the Soviet Union was out there on the other side of the world, but suddenly a Soviet satellite is, just passing right overhead. So suddenly that distance, of this other power is brought so much closer by space. And of course, if they can put a satellite up there, well, why not a nuclear bomb? So, from there's the fear factor that kind of pushed the drive into space. But always there was something more. I mean, there was that, of course, historic speech that John F. Kennedy delivered, challenging the nation to go to the moon, and really pushing forward science and technology in the United States and throughout the rest of the Western world, where space was sort of a focal point that drove all kinds of scientific innovations. So it's in that sort of zone of there are practical spin-offs. There's a technical challenge, where there might be some gain by tackling that technical challenge, but at the same time, it's always been this inspiration. And I think that inspiration was so intense during the moon landings that even now we're still in the glow of that Apollo period. There are still lots of people alive who remember the moon landings, even though the astronauts themselves are really at an advanced age now, those Apollo astronauts. Many people remember the moon landings, and there's that sense of, it must lead to something else. But the tricky thing is figuring out what is that something else. Certainly there are scientific goals to be pursued, but I think there's a craving for a larger human goal. And perhaps in the long term there is a human goal. In the 1,000-year reference frame, it may well be that it's the destiny of humans to go beyond Earth, perhaps to go elsewhere in the solar system, to go elsewhere even to other solar systems. Who knows, once we get into the centuries beyond this one. The question is how fast and what are those next few steps that we should take.
Okay, Ivan, we're going to talk about space exploration later this week, but thanks for getting us off to a good start today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.